Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much indeed for the warmth of your welcome, which I have experienced this afternoon when I arrived here, and also directly experienced from you this evening. It's a particular pleasure for me to have the opportunity to be with you tonight. I thought when you invited me to speak in this great new building, you might be inviting me to demonstrate my skills at basketball. But it is good to see you. First of all, before I go into my main address, may I also thank you for your care and support over the past years. I've met many people today who have said how they remembered not only, of course, myself, but remembered my companions who were detained for the 5 years. And if I may speak on their behalf, your support and care and continued concern means a great deal to us. And I'm also very happy to be here in this university setting and bring you greetings from my own university, where I am at Trinity Hall in Cambridge, England. And I bring you greetings from that university, which is just a little older than this campus. My own college, Trinity Hall, was founded in 1350. And when I saw my rooms, I didn't think they'd been decorated since 1350. One of the remarkable phenomena following my release and the release of my fellows was the fact that I received an enormous amount of mail from right across the world. So much so that at Lambeth Palace in London, which is the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury and his principal office, 4 secretaries were employed full-time simply opening the mail and responding to it. There are something like 60 to 80,000 letters which I have yet to look at, and that will take some considerable time to get through. The mail has dropped off now somewhat to around about 100 letters a week, which makes it a little more manageable. But the reason for mentioning that is because I begin my narrative account today by telling you about a letter I received. My home in London is right by Greenwich Park, near the River Thames. And each year, the London Marathon starts in Greenwich Park. And this year, because it starts just behind my house, the organizers invited me to start the marathon, simply to drop the flag. So on the morning of the race, which, as you know, goes for just a little over 26 miles, I went out of my house and crossed the heath. And as I was crossing the heath, I came across a small family, 2 children, 2 small children and their mother. I noticed, by the way, 2 small children sitting up at the top, at the back there. And I'd just like to say I'm glad to see them. Nice to see you here tonight. I stopped, as I usually do, and had a word with the children. and their mother and went on my way. A week later, a letter arrived, and it was from the lady to whom I'd spoken. And she said, as you were walking across the heath to go to the start of the marathon, you spoke to my children. Did you notice how the little girl of 4 stared at you? As you were coming across the heath, her brother, who is 7, said, oh, look, there's Mr. Waite, a famous man. He was a hostage for 5 years. You came to our surprise and you spoke to us. And when you went away, the little girl of 4 turned to me, her mother, and she said, Mummy, is it right? Was that man really an ostrich for 5 years? Some of the letters have been less than amusing. I'm reminded of another letter. On the day that I went to meet the captors of the hostages for the last time, and I will, in a moment or two, give you a more detailed account of that experience. I was in a hotel room and I packed my cases and left them locked in the room, ready to leave Beirut after the meeting. I went to the meeting, and again I shall talk about that in a moment, and of course it was an extended stay which lasted not for a few hours or a few days, but 5 years. When I eventually came out of captivity, I expected that I would never see my personal belongings again, and certainly not my briefcase and my papers. To my delight and surprise, they had been taken by a colleague of mine, or a friend of mine, I should say, who was in the press corps. He'd taken them and delivered them to the British Embassy. And after 5 years, I received my cases intact and opened my briefcase and went through the papers that were there. I'd forgotten what I had with me. There was, in that case, a letter which I had received about 10 days before going back to the city, to the Lebanon. And it was from a woman who'd lived in the Lebanon together with her husband for many years, an Italian couple. And she said to me in that letter, please, will you try and help us? My husband and I have lived in Beirut for years. We've lived quietly. He has done no harm to anyone, but now he's disappeared. And I don't know where he is, and we are at our wits' end. Please, will you try and help? When I read the letter, I'm afraid it brought tears to my eyes after all those years, because the situation is almost certain that that lady will never see her husband again. Almost certainly, he died in captivity. And she, along with many other people in the Middle East, not just Europeans, but Lebanese and others, will have to live and bear the agony of never knowing what happened to their husband, her husband, in those last days, how he died, what he felt, and the opportunity to mourn is not given to her. I still receive letters from people who are desperate to know what has happened to those of their family who've gone missing. And the letters come from all sections of the community in the Middle East, not just Christians, but from Muslims and others. It's a terrible business. It's a cruel business, because the family are left always with a nagging hope in the back of their mind that perhaps one day there will be some news. And the news hardly ever comes. It's for these humanitarian reasons that the Church in the first instance, the Church in England and a part of the Anglican Communion, related of course to the Episcopal Church here in the United States of America, it is for humanitarian reasons that the Church first became involved with hostages. It wasn't because we claimed great international expertise or great political expertise. It was my job to advise the then Archbishop of Canterbury on international affairs. And of course, we had a wide knowledge of questions affecting countries around the world, political, economic, religious. But people turned to us not because of that expertise, but because they hoped that we would be able to bring humanitarian considerations to bear upon problems which seem to defeat, and understandably defeat, so many people. The first involvement with hostages for myself goes back many years into Africa. My days when I lived in Uganda and with my family went through the revolutionary times when General Amin came to power. But the principal involvement, and the first significant one, which I will outline for you to begin with, was when I was at Lambeth Palace and we were approached by the families of people who had been taken hostage in Iran. At that time, in the early 1980s, Iran was passing through revolutionary times, as is well known and well documented. The Shah had been deposed, the Ayatollah Khomeini was in power, and there was a considerable amount of turmoil in the country. Not surprisingly, in all revolutionary situations of that kind, small groups of foreigners and small groups of those who differ in ideology or religion from the mainstream ideology and religion of the country become targets and a focus for suspicion. That suspicion at that time centered on the small but dedicated Anglican Church in Iran. And there are very simple reasons for that. At a time of revolution, it's almost as though some members of the community develop a form of paranoia that makes people extraordinarily suspicious of anyone who doesn't fit in with the main line. The Anglican Church became a target of suspicion because it had been noted that from time to time people from the British Embassy had gone into that building. Now you can say that is suspicious. On the other hand, it is quite natural and normal that people from England who would belong to the Church of England would go to worship in their own building. It depends how you look at the situation. Because members of the British Embassy had been seen going in the building, certain radicals therefore assumed that this was, in fact, a nest of spies. And 3 English church workers were taken hostage, and 4 Iranians, 2 Iranian clergymen and 2 lay people. We received early notification of this in London, and for a while we kept very quiet, hoping that they would be discovered and that their release would be gained through the normal diplomatic channels without any further intervention. The months went by and no news was received. Eventually, the families came to us and said, "Please, can you help?" And of course, we couldn't refuse that request. The first problem, of course, in a situation of this kind is to gain access to the country, and so I applied myself to the Iranian embassy in London for a visa. It took a long, long time, and I never thought the visa would come through. And then, on Christmas Eve, I remember being in my office and saying to my secretary, "I think we have no luck this year." And I went out to do some Christmas shopping. When I came back, the visa had arrived, and the following morning, Christmas morning, I was on an Iranian civil airliner bound for Tehran. The first problem, as I said, is to get access to the situation. And the second problem, which is one which presents an independent person such as myself with considerable difficulty, in fact would present anyone with considerable difficulty, is to how to make contact with those who are holding the hostages. And there are no set guidelines. It is difficult and dangerous, and risks have to be taken. Always, governments would be obliged and are obliged to warn people such as myself not to step foot in that situation because they have to say it is too dangerous. And they are right, it is dangerous. And one has to make a calculation and say, if one is going to be involved in the negotiations, then you make a full and fair assessment of the situation insofar as you can and make a recognition of the dangers that are present. On arrival in Iran, this was the first problem that faced me, how to make contact. The small church community had not met for a long period of time. Their clergy had been taken and they had been scattered. And so I decided that I would call them together for a Christmas service. I got on the telephone, I had the numbers of certain church leaders, and I asked them to pass the message around. On the evening of the service, I went to the small church building, wondering if anyone would turn up. And sure enough, The door of the church opened and people began to come in until the church was really quite full. I am not a clergyman, I am a layman. But I took a service as best I could and climbed into the pulpit to give a Christmas address, the first service that these people had had for a long, long time. I wanted them to be encouraged and supported. After about 5 minutes, the side door of the church opened again, and into the room came 6 or 8 Revolutionary Guards, dressed in their full uniform and carrying automatic weapons, which they brought with them into the building. In Anglican churches, the front pew is normally empty, and so the guards came and they sat in the front pew. They clattered their automatics down before them and sat with their arms folded, looking at me. My only response to that was, well, I said, I'm pleased to welcome you. You're rather late for the service and you've missed the first 5 minutes. I shall begin again. And so I began my address again. I couldn't think of anything else to say. At the end of that address and at the end of the service, I went down and shook them by the hand. And to my surprise, a man who identified himself as their leader said, "We like what you say. We will take you to see your people." Well, now, that sounds very simplistic. But in fact, that presents and raises yet another issue. Whom in those situations do you trust? Who is genuine? The people who came into the church building could have been anyone. They could have been out to kidnap me and to take me. Is it reasonable to take a risk and to go with them in the night across Tehran with the hope that truth is being told and that this might be the first step in a long process of negotiation? Or should one say no and back away? In that situation, there are a few guidelines, and one can only go on what I would say is a reasonably developed intuition, an intuition which might be able to tell you that truth is being spoken. Intuition is a useful ability, but it's not infallible. It's good when it works, and when it doesn't, it can be disastrous. I decided on the basis of intuition that it was in fact an opportunity worth following. And so I said, yes, I will come with you. We set out and got into the car and drove across the city. We drove for about half an hour and then came to a large camp which was being used as an interrogation camp. There were people there of all nationalities. I went into the camp and then was introduced for the first time, to my great relief, to John and Audrey Coleman, the British couple. John was a doctor and a clergyman. His wife was with him, and they'd both been kept there for weeks and weeks without change of clothing, and simply with a mattress on the floor in this building. Later, they took me to meet Jean Waddell, another Scottish lady who'd been a secretary in the church, who'd opened her door one night and was shot half strangled and left for dead. When she made some form of recovery, she was taken and thrown into the Avine prison. And I was able to gain access to the Avine prison and meet with Jean. And eventually I was taken to see the 4 Iranians. After a long process of discussion and negotiation through the guards who were in relationship with the Ayatollah, it was possible to convince them that these were innocent people and that they should be released. I formed a personal and somewhat friendly relationship with the leader of the Revolutionary Guard. He took me to his home, and he produced a large photograph album. He turned the pages over, and he said, "These are my brothers." There were 6 or 7 photographs. This one is dead. This one is dead. All of them have had to discontinue their education. He was a man, and as a family, they had suffered greatly. In the previous regime, their family had suffered appalling persecution. Which leads me to the point that hostage-taking and terrorism of that kind are really secondaries. They're not the primary problem. They stem from situations of grave injustice, situations that have been running on for year after year. Situations of injustice provide a seedbed for acts which become violent acts and which do great harm on innocent people. But it is as well to bear in mind that sometimes those who commit acts of terrorism, they themselves and their families have suffered grave injustice for years. Not for one moment do I condone acts of terrorism, nor for one moment do I believe that a political end is served by employing unjust methods to achieve it. But I begin to understand at that point, or I began to understand at that point, how it is that conflict occurs of the kind we have become so familiar with in recent years. When these hostages were safely back home, we were quickly thrown into another hostage situation in Libya. And I will not detail that tonight in any considerable way. I will move on to Beirut. But simply to say that British hostages were taken in Libya, and we again were approached by their relatives, and I set out for Libya and had face-to-face discussions with Colonel Gaddafi. He knew my size, as one amusing story. He knew that I was a tall person, and when I went to meet him, I noted that he'd put on his high-heel shoes, particularly too. He made sure, though, that I sat cross-legged at his feet while he sat way up on a podium. But nevertheless, we had interesting and useful discussions together, which resulted in the release of the people from Libya. Now, I mention this background because I want to come now more specifically and pointedly to Beirut. Because we had gained that form of reputation at Lambeth, It meant, of course, that we were receiving then requests from all over the place, many of which we had simply to say no to. We were approached in the first instance regarding the Lebanon by the Presbyterian Church of America, for whom I have a great respect. Fred Wilson from the Presbyterian Church came to Lambeth and asked us to try and work on behalf of Ben Weir, who was captured after working for many years in the Lebanon in very hard and difficult circumstances. He also asked if we would intervene on behalf of Martin Jenko, a Roman Catholic priest. We said no, because we were overextended, and because in my own assessment I had said that it seemed that the problem in the Lebanon was going to run on for years, that it was enormously complicated by politics, and that I was doubtful whether, without a very long-term commitment, it would be possible to move the situation. The representatives from the church went away, and sometime later they returned, and on the second time we said no. And on the third time, when they came back, the situation had become increasingly serious. More hostages have been taken in the Lebanon. Terry Anderson, the correspondent from the Associated Press, John McCarthy from England, Brian Keenan from Ireland, and so on and so forth. A whole string of people had been captured, and at that point we said, well, yes, we will try. Knowing very well some of the difficulties. Again, access to the country, this time, was not difficult. There was no problem, really, with a visa. One could simply get on a plane in London and travel to Lebanon. But the same problem occurred as to how do you make contact. I'd had a message through contacts that the kidnappers would speak with me and wanted to speak with me, and that they would make contact with me via a shortwave radio. And so I established myself in the apartment of Terry Anderson, which was on the corniche overlooking the sea. And I stayed in his apartment, sitting by a shortwave radio, tuned into the right frequency, and I sat by that radio for day and night for quite some time. Eventually, as is often the case in these matters, the message didn't come via the radio. Simply one evening, the telephone rang, and someone said, meet me in an hour's time at a certain address, which happened to be a doctor's surgery, a doctor's consulting room near to the American University of Beirut. I put the phone down and again had to consider the same old familiar ground. Is this genuine? Is it a trick? What will happen? I had bodyguards with me, but it's absolutely useless. The bodyguards were local people, but it's absolutely useless to take bodyguards with you for a meeting of that kind. It would simply be a provocative act. I decided again that this was a chance worth taking. And so I set out in a car with my bodyguards, who stopped 200 or 300 yards away from the house. They left me to walk the last few paces to the house. They went away, and I went in and met the doctor. He said to me, I'm sorry, but you'll have to be blindfolded for the discussions. That's a not too much of a hardship, but it presents a difficulty in negotiating. You can't see people's reactions, obviously. And if you depend a great deal on intuition in a negotiating process, it is a handicap. But, again, it's a handicap one had to accept. Several men, I was blindfolded, and several men came into the room. First of all, one had to determine what it was they wanted, and whether or not they were the people who actually did have access to the hostages. Immediately I said to them, "Will you take me to see the people you're holding?" They discussed amongst themselves and said, "No, we can't do that." Then I said, "I brought this camera with me, this Polaroid camera. Will you take it and bring me pictures so that I can have some absolute proof that you are genuine, that you have access to them?" They said they would do that. There was a newspaper on the doctor's desk. I signed it, and I gave them the newspaper, and I said, "Please bring me back pictures as soon as you can, of each person holding this newspaper with my signature on it." They went away, and within a period of time returned with photographs of the American hostages. Those photographs have never appeared in public. I still have them in my possession. And it made me smile when I saw press reports at one stage after I was released saying Terry Waite was bluffing, he had no contact with the captors or the hostages at that point. No one knew, of course, that those pictures of the American hostages were and still are in my possession. We could then, when I had the photographs, get down to the discussion. What is it you want? What it was, in the first instance, was that the captors required intervention on their behalf for their compatriots who had been imprisoned in Kuwait, accused of various illegal activities in that country. I made it quite clear that there was no way in which the church, and I as a representative of the church at that time, could actually intervene in a process that was outside the due process of law. But I could and would try to get into Kuwait and to do everything possible on humanitarian grounds to see that these people were being properly looked after, and if in fact they had been unjustly detained, to pursue the matter, and certainly to convey messages from their families to these people. The captors readily accepted that. They went away again and brought me handwritten messages from the families, and I went away hoping that I would get support, political support, to get into Kuwait on humanitarian grounds. Thus began an extraordinarily difficult year of attempting to get access on humanitarian grounds only into that prison in Kuwait. I got absolutely nowhere. I, of course, came to your country, to here, to the United States, to discuss the situation, because there were American hostages. And this raises an important question about, which has often been speculated about, the relationship with Colonel Oliver North. Colonel Oliver North was the person designated by the American administration to be responsible on behalf of the administration for hostages. Just as there were others designated with that responsibility from other governments. France, United Kingdom, different places. Anyone in a position such as myself, and I was the only person, so far as I know, to have had a face-to-face contact, albeit blindfolded, with the captors, it was quite natural that one should have contact with the various governments involved. Absolutely no mystery about it. In fact, the kidnappers knew that and expected me to have contact with the various administrations. They expected that, and if I had not have had that contact, I would have not had much credibility at all in their eyes. It's as simple and straightforward as that. But the critical and key question comes, were you, myself, as a church member, did you know about arms dealing? Were you implicated in that? And the simple and straightforward answer is a clear no. There is no way in which I ever would or could engage in that sort of business. I just do not believe it, or believe in it. If governments or political agencies wish to engage in that, that is their business. But it cannot be my business, and it cannot be the business of the church to do that. Why wasn't I told? I don't know clearly the answer to that, but I can surmise. The answer to it, of course, is that if I had been told, it was clearly known that I would have pulled away from the situation. And insofar as I was the only person to have face-to-face contact with the kidnappers, those from different governments would not wish me to pull away from the situation. As simple as that. No more mystery to it. I do regard it as a matter of regret that there wasn't sufficient political support to get access to Kuwait on humanitarian grounds. I would not, in any way, have acted outside due process of law, but I am of the belief that a visit on humanitarian grounds to those prisoners would have eased the situation. It's of interest to note that at the time when I was making serious efforts to get into Kuwait, both Martin Jenko and Ben Weir were released. 2 churchmen in the first months. Why? We can speculate about it, but a reasonable speculation could be that the kidnappers were sending a signal to the church and saying, we would like you to encourage you in your efforts, keep moving forward. Of course, they could be playing off both at the same time, encouraging the church, and if the allegations of arms dealing are correct, at the same time playing that particular game. Because there are 2 strands in the argument. On the one hand, there's Iranian influence in the kidnapping, which relates to the whole political scenario of arms dealing, and on the other hand, there's Lebanese influence, concern for the people in Kuwait. The 2 come together, and you can see how complicated the whole matter is. When it became public knowledge that there had been arms dealing, or there were allegations of that, and the whole story broke, I was in Wiesbaden at the time with David Jacobson, and that was the first I'd heard of it when it became public knowledge. And immediately I was faced with a decision. Do I at this point pull right out, or do I stay in? I knew very well from released hostages that they had a radio, and I knew how much to their morale it meant that people were in there working for them. I knew how disappointed they were when I went back one Christmas with the hope of seeing some release and had to leave because nothing came of the visit. I know how disappointed the hostages were. And I felt at that point that insofar as they were suffering disappointment as a result of the political management of the situation, that disappointment would have been increased had I decided to pull out myself. I said, I cannot leave them nor their relatives. I will return and attempt to pick up the pieces. And so I went back for the second principal visit. There were other smaller visits in between. I went back, and again a message came through from the captors. We would like to see you. I went to see them, the same place, the doctor's house. I told them that it was proving to be extremely difficult to get into Kuwait, but I would continue my efforts. They were disappointed, but they said, all right. They then said, Terry Anderson and Tom Sutherland are both very sick, and they're very depressed at the latest news. Because they are so sick and so depressed, and they may die, we'll give you an opportunity to come and see them. You asked a year ago, we said no, but now because they're in such a bad condition, we'll let you come and see them. Again, faced with a dilemma. Is this a trick? Were they really sick? Was this a ploy? There's really no way of answering it. You just have to sit there and make a decision. I said, you'll keep me. If I come with you, you'll keep me. No, they said. All right. Give me your word as a Muslim that you won't. And the leader stretched out his hand and said, we will not keep you. I still wasn't convinced. I said, I'm not coming with you tonight. I'm going back to think about it. They agreed to that. I went back to my room and had discussion with those people who were good advisors, local people, Muslims, friendly and able people. I said, what is the risk? I told them the story. They said, if he's given you his word as a Muslim, he shouldn't keep you. We don't think he will. All right, I said, I'll return. So the second night, I locked my cases, as I told you at the beginning of this small talk, went out and went back to the doctor's surgery. The doctor went out and left me alone. After 10 minutes or so, I heard the lift coming up. My contact met me. We went out together, down into the car, across Beirut, into an apartment where I was told to stay for a while. And then began the process that anyone will have to go through if you go to negotiate in these circumstances, which shows you how ridiculous some of the statements can be that are made about, for example, locator devices. One has to be totally stripped and searched. Every scar in the body is examined. Your teeth are examined. Your hair is examined to see if anything is being implanted in the body. as a locator device. And if there is anything found, I can tell you, you wouldn't leave that building alive. And I certainly wouldn't be here today if anything had been found, or if I was carrying anything. When that process was over, we moved to another place and went around from building to building over a period of a few days, a procedure that I expected. Eventually one night, we drove into a garage. A trapdoor was lifted in the floor, and I was asked to climb down. I did so with great apprehension, wondering if I was being ushered into the presence of other hostages who were sick, or whether this in fact was my capture. It was in fact my capture. I was put into a tiled cell, the door was closed, and I was left there sitting on the floor. No furniture, absolutely nothing. Tiled ceiling, walls, floor. Always an unpleasant sign, as it's an easy way to clean up, of course, if you're knocking somebody about. There were other people in adjacent cells. A whole complex had been built underground. And this is just one of the many underground prisons there are in the Middle East. Places where Lebanese hostages, and let us not forget them, have been kept, some of them for years, in a completely self-contained underground prison, deadly silent except for the small hum of a generator. And I sat on the floor and I said, that's it, I'm a hostage myself. And there were three things that I do remember that came to mind and which helped me survive in those years. No self-pity, no regrets, and no over-sentimentality. Self-pity seemed to me to be an absolute killer. Over-sentimentality is so easy to fall into, to think of the things one ought to have done for one's family or one's children and hadn't done. The times when one ought to have been a little more human, a little more understanding, a little more forgiving, a little more generous. And that can so often so lead into over-sentimentality that you begin to fall into despair and the spirit can die. I shall skip over the interrogations, the times of torture and misery. I'm trying to write about them at the moment. It is easier to write about them than to speak about them. And I hope that that writing will be published in America next year. But I skip over them for the moment. Why did they take me? I think because they made a calculation. They recognized that I had not got the political support to get into Kuwait, and they were impatient. And they felt also that they probably, insofar as I had a high profile, would have greater leverage if they held on to me rather than if they let me continue in my activities. That's part of the answer. There are other, more complex political arguments to be brought forward which can be derived from an understanding of the local politics of the situation, which again I shall explain in greater detail when I write about it. But I think that's it. Why put me through interrogation and torture? For the simple reason that if you have somebody, you might as well try and find out what, if anything, he knows, because every little bit of information is of interest. The weeks went into months, and the months went into years, and one was kept in total solitary. How do I view my captors? I was angry. I was angry at broken promises. I was not hateful, because hate, I think, is a power which would lead one to wish for the destruction of others. Anger, I think, is a legitimate human emotion. And sometimes one expresses that anger to them. After the interrogation, they told me that they believed quite clearly that I was, as you would put it, straight up. And I think they probably would have released me earlier had it not been for the whole Salman Rushdie event in the United Kingdom. And that further complicated the situation. I can genuinely say that I have no feelings of hate against them, because I go back to what I said earlier, that terrorism springs, and these acts spring from people who themselves have suffered. These young men who've been caught up in this movement had seen their own families scattered. They'd experienced murder in their own families. They had lived with bitterness for years. That doesn't excuse perpetrating injustice on others. It simply helps understand the dynamics of the situation. I was presented on one occasion with an opportunity to escape. Time will not allow me to detail that in any great way. But in my negotiations prior to my capture, I had always said, give up violence, try and find other ways of resolving your problems. You have intelligence, you have ability, use it, and don't be drawn into the circle of violence. When I was presented with an opportunity to escape, it was simply because a guard had forgotten his automatic and left it, a place where I could get access to it. And I knew if I picked it up, I could shoot him and probably get away. There was a risk, but I certainly could have shot him. And it came back to me, which said, what did you say in your negotiations? When people are in a tight corner, don't use violence. And now you're in a tight corner, are you going to use violence? And I simply had to put that temptation to one side and not to do it. It wasn't easy. I simply think it means that one in those situations must be consistent, even though the personal cost is high. And I don't say that for any reasons of self-glorification, not for one moment. Simply to say that I do believe in dealing with these problems, what must be paramount, truth and integrity. And in the end, that will carry through. I come through the experience more convinced than ever in my work for justice and for peace and for reconciliation. I have, in fact, as a result of this experience, been enormously strengthened, even though the experience was black, dark, and difficult, and extremely painful to bear. I come through it with a sense of compassion and feeling for those who suffer, which has been deepened. And I come through it with 3 simple sentences engraved on my heart. To somehow, in the years that are left to me in my life, to enable the weak and the powerless to be strong, to enable the strong to be just, and to enable the just, beyond everything, to be compassionate. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Terry Waite, thank you for sharing your story and your feelings with us as part of UniverCity 92. And thank all of you for joining us this evening. There are many more interesting programs yet to come in UniverCity 92 tomorrow and Friday, and we invite you to attend as many as you can. Again, thank you for being with us tonight.
What do you think, as you grew up, influenced you to choose the profession that you chose rather than becoming a rock star or a cricket player or a university lecturer, let's say?
Well, I think if I look back to my roots, they were in a small Cheshire village. Cheshire being a county in the north of England. And I grew up in that environment as a member of the local Anglican church, which would in America be the Episcopal church. Right. And I sang in the choir there. And music, in fact, has been one of my interests throughout life. Not that I can play any musical instrument, unfortunately. But during those years, which were formative years, I suppose I grew to a deeper understanding of the Christian faith, almost by osmosis, not necessarily by great intellectual effort. It wasn't until much later in life that I had to struggle more, certainly, with intellectual questions of belief and faith. And I think two strands came together in later life. On the one hand, an inquisitive nature, a desire to see the world and to understand more as to how people function and behave. And on the other hand, a commitment to the ideals and tenets of Christianity, I think predominantly to the humanistic elements within that faith, the teaching and the wisdom of Christ in his dealings with individuals. And then a third strand entered in when I was a young man, and that was an increased knowledge of interpersonal relationships, conflict resolution, and that whole range of studies which you probably recollect were fairly popular in the 60s, or being pioneered in the 60s. And putting these things together resulted in my working with the church. I never had a desire to be ordained, that is to turn my collar round and become a minister. But the church provided a base for me to engage in the type of work that I eventually have been caught up in all my life.
Very good. You said in your talk last night that the Presbyterian Church of the United States basically came to you 3 times on the Ben Weir case. It's almost biblical. And the first time you said no, the second time you said no, and the third time you said yes. I wonder if you could expand a little bit on why that third time you felt, and the Anglican Church felt impelled to put you in the hostage situation.
I was working with Robert Runcie, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, and I was based in London at Lambeth Palace. He has 2 bases in the United Kingdom. One, his principal office in London, and another one in the See of Canterbury. And he spends most of his time in London, and that's where his principal staff were. And we became involved in Lambeth Palace in hostage negotiation work as a result of Anglicans being captured in Iran in the early 1980s. And because we were successful in that particular endeavor in securing the release, or assisting in the securing of the release, I never know ever just how many factors enter into the securing of release of anybody, but we were one element in that. And then, as a reputation grew, then of course we were asked to do many other things, and thousands of approaches were made to do this, that, and the other. The next significant one was with Libya, and the third one, which you just mentioned,
was with Beirut and the request from the Presbyterian Church. I mean, I think the Presbyterian Church were absolutely admirable. They were not trying to pressurize us at all. They were simply coming and discussing the situation and saying, we're desperate, and it does seem to us as though any governmental intervention will not necessarily be successful or effective, and they seem to have the indication that the church could help. I think the third time we said yes, well, there were several factors that had influenced us. One was the concern that the Presbyterian Church showed, and the obvious desire of the families that we should become involved, and the growing desperation of the families. And the second thing was the fact that something that hasn't been widely broadcast, but that the hostages, or some of the hostages themselves, actually wrote a letter from their prison cell in Beirut asking for my involvement. And that was a key factor which did swing the situation, because we felt that if their captors had allowed them to actually write a letter, then that might be an indication that the captors were willing to talk with some neutral party. And so that was the final element that swung the thing.
When you were captured and held hostage, did your captors, who presumably were also involved in kidnapping many of the other hostages, did they ever suggest why they released Weir and Jenko and Jacobson when they did?
They gave absolutely no details to me of their motives or actions. And if they ever did, one always had a suspicion that if they ever gave anything away, which was very little, one had to be very cautious about it. But the straight answer to that question is no.
Do you have any speculation of your own on those three releases of what?
Oh, yes, I do, yes. Initially, the captors were hoping that I would be able at least to ease the situation of Shiite prisoners who were held in Kuwait. And of course they wanted the release, and I made it clear in my discussions with them that I wouldn't be able to act outside due process of law, but nevertheless I would do my very best to ensure that there was a humanitarian approach made, which I attempted to try and get for a long time, and got no access to Kuwait. I think then they took hold of me because they felt that I simply was not going to get political support to get into Kuwait. And therefore they made a quick assessment and said, well, perhaps it's better if we hold him, as he's got a high profile, and that might bring us greater returns than allowing him to continue in his endeavors in Kuwait.
Why do you think they didn't release you in, say, August of 1990, when actually the Iranians released the 17 prisoners, or the Iraqis released the 17 prisoners?
I think they were, well, at that point, I think they were waiting then for the political changes just to take place more effectively in Iran. I mean, I think we were released eventually, of course, because of the whole scenario, the whole political change that had taken place both in Iran and was taking place there and then in the world generally and in the Middle East in particular. And I think they were just waiting for things to consolidate. I don't think there was a great mystery about it.
The United States and Israel and Kuwait all claimed a no ransom for hostages policy. Was this public stance appropriate in your view?
Well, I think if you're going to make a public stance, it's got to be also carried through in private. I think you've got to, if you're going to claim integrity, you've got to actually see it through properly. So,
which only the Kuwaitis seem to do.
My view on that is that whilst this, I'd like to debate the subject at some point in more detail, but I put a tentative view forward, namely that I think it's ill-advised, generally speaking, for governments to get involved in direct negotiations with hostages. I think with kidnappers, not with hostages, because I think that actually sometimes kidnappers really just want to get governments tangled up and get them, as you might say, screwed up. And they often succeed. I think it's much better if that policy is adopted and that any discussions with kidnappers should take place by perhaps special units set up in the UN composed of volunteers, or Red Cross agencies or church agencies, who in turn would do as I've done, liaise with governments, but not be in the control or in the pay of governments, be independent. And so at this point in my thinking, I would advocate that governments didn't do that.
Do you think, this is a very hypothetical question, that if somehow you had never met Colonel North, would you still have been captured when you were captured? Or is this just...
Debatable question. I don't think I could answer it. I think the fact that, well, let me go back a bit. The kidnappers certainly knew very clearly that I was in touch with the American administration. And I made no secret of that. I knew that intelligence is such in the Middle East that you can keep very little secret. And if I'm going to fly into Beirut, as I did, on one occasion in an American helicopter, that's not going to go unnoticed. I'm not so daft as to think, I think that might go unnoticed. I mean, I only did it. Well, I did it for two reasons. One, because it was a secure way of getting in and a quick way of getting in at a time when I needed to get in securely and quickly. That's the first thing. And secondly, because there was no mystery about it. There was absolutely no mystery about it. The kidnappers knew I was in touch with America, as they knew I was in touch with Britain, and they knew I was in touch with France, and so on and so forth. So that's that. But I think one faction of the group who were holding me really were very curious as to what was going on between myself and America and between Iran and America. Because you have the double business, you see. You have Iranian influence on the kidnappers, and you have the kidnappers, some of who are Lebanese Shiite, working closely with the Iranians. Not always, exactly. So you not only do you have, you know, one set of local American relationships, but you have group relationships within the context of the Lebanon and within the context of Iran and the Lebanon. So it's extraordinarily complicated. And I think we're saying, well, is someone pulling a fast one here? Could Iran and America be pulling a fast one on us, or whatever? And so I think they added it all up, said Waite's not going to get anywhere with the release of our prisoners in Kuwait. Therefore, we might as well pull him in and see what he knows and use him as a card. That's about it.
Okay. Did you at all feel used by Mr. North? I know there was a lot of verbiage out there that he saw you as a useful humanitarian, almost smokescreen to which he could hide behind the arms for hire.
Well, I think it's, you know, the evidence that I've seen, it's pretty hard to deny that. And you asked me my feeling. I don't necessarily think it was the wisest thing to do. I can understand why it was done. I mean, clearly, your administration, the American administration, wasn't going to tell me that they were dealing with arms. First, because they'd say, well, that fellow's too leaky anyway. He'd let it know. And secondly, they'd say, well, if we tell him, if he gets to know that, he'll walk away. Because they knew very clearly my views. And thirdly, they weren't going to want to let go of me, simply because, I think it's true to say, I was the only person who had a direct contact, a direct actual meeting, and was in touch with the kidnappers. Now, if I wanted to be sharp and hard, which I don't wish to be, and I don't want to, put it another way, I don't want to try and be smart with hindsight, because it's very easy to be smart with hindsight. But, I mean, if I were trying to be a little smart with hindsight, I might say, well, I wish that hadn't happened, because it might have given us a chance gently to ease the situation I wish I got political backing to get into Kuwait, because that would have eased the situation, I think, and we might have made progress without these other complicating factors. But I recognize life is life and these things happen.
Father Jenko was quoted as saying, when he found out about the arms for hostages, that he called it tremendous foolishness. And he talked about, he's single, he has no children, and he felt the fact that arms that would be used to kill people might have helped gain his release. Again, he seemed to feel that there was something really
Oh, I think he's absolutely right. I mean, knowing Martin Jenko, he, like myself, wouldn't wish for that at all. Before I went on my own last journey before being captured, and I left a tape behind. On this tape I said, if I am captured, I don't want any ransom to be paid for me or any exchange to be made for me, nor anyone to put themselves in extreme danger for myself. I'll take what's coming. Because I would take exactly the same view as Martin Jenko. But recognizing, I mean, that is my view, and that's a personal view, and it's his personal view, but recognizing, of course, that these things do happen constantly in international politics. I don't condone them, and I think, in fact, in the long run, they do enormous damage, and they're just short-term expedients, and in the long run, they do an awful lot of harm.
Have you been asked, since you've gotten back, to be involved in any kinds of negotiations, say in Bosnia or Somalia or any of the, not exactly hostage situations, but situations of conflict?
Oh yes, I have, and in fact I've already made a contribution along with Terry Anderson and Martin Jenko and Brian Keenan in Northern Ireland. I mean, people on the whole have been very, very understanding. But there have been a number of requests, and a lot of requests, to be increasingly involved in the Irish situation, with which I have personal links. And just several days before making this particular tape, I was in Ireland with those three men, three former hostages, making a contribution into a conference entitled Beyond Hate, and speaking at a meeting, a large public meeting, which was absolutely crammed to the doors, in the city of Londonderry, in the Guildhall, speaking on this subject. And there have been lots of invitations to be more deeply involved in that. But one has to wait a little bit. I mean, I need a time to write and to collect myself together, in a sense, and be ready and prepared to make a fuller contribution. But I certainly intend to be back in the arena, so to speak. This experience hasn't deterred me at all. Yeah.
This next question my wife asked me to ask you.
Right.
She teaches literature here at Ball State. As you are writing your own memoirs or account of your own experience, have you read any other of the genre of hostage or prison literature? And if you have, is there anything that stands out in your mind?
Well, there are several books that stand out in my mind. I haven't read, deliberately I haven't read, a lot of the stuff that's been written about me. It's all speculative, and no one has ever consulted me about a book they've written about me. I mean, a lot of it was written actually before I was released, and then published, even before I had a chance to open my mouth, so that's one thing. I haven't read any of the other hostage books, but in the realm of literature, yes. I mean, I think I suppose one book that stands out in my mind is Arthur Koestler's book, Darkness at Noon, that classic book. Before I was captured, I remember being closely involved with the foundation and giving away the Koestler Awards, and I've got a strong affinity with the man and with his ideals. And I've read that book with particular interest, both before and after capture. Solzhenitsyn, of course. I mean, who could fail to read him? And not only does he give a penetrating insight into the dynamics of terror and captivity, but he's able to express it in that wonderful poetic way, and truly remarkable. And then I suppose also I've grown into a deeper appreciation of writers such as Joyce, because I've always had an appreciation for Joyce, James Joyce that is. But I think that why appreciation deepens is a result of a solitary confinement when you come into relationship with the free flow of the unconscious in a way that you don't necessarily when you're in the world and constantly bombarded by television and radio and music and newspapers and magazines and everything. And somehow Joyce, in his ability to express that free flow in a marvelously poetic way, is someone with whom I appreciate.
One final question, Mr. Waite. Presumably this tape will be forever, okay? And 50, 100 years from now, a Ball State student may come into the room here or the library and watch it. Mm-hmm. What would sort of your summary of what your experience has taught you that you would like that student 50 years from now to see the last thing you say and then walk out into the world?
Well, it's a very big question, and I suppose it must center around suffering. That suffering comes to all of us in greater or lesser, to greater and lesser or lesser degree, and that it need not necessarily destroy. It's possible to face it and to feel the impact of it, certainly, and in some ways to be ravaged by it. But it is possible to grow through it and live through it, and to find a new and a different strength, to find that deep down within there are resources that can aid us in our survival, that they are in fact resident within us, deep down in the unconscious, one might say, waiting there to sustain and support us, and that people can take you and can chain you and can capture your body and can do what they wish to your body. But ultimately they can never capture the essential spirit that lies within you. And whilst you may suffer, somehow that spirit can be strengthened and live through it more fully. So whatever experiences come in life, they needn't destroy.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.